300 guests filled that cathedral. The flowers alone cost $40,000. The champagne was imported. The wedding cake had its own security detail. Everything about that wedding was designed to send one message: we won. And right there in the front row, dead center where every single guest would see it, an empty chair. Not forgotten. Not an accident. Reserved. With a name card. Zarina. The groom, Marcus, had placed it there himself. His idea. His little masterpiece. Because Marcus didn't just want to get married today. He wanted her to watch. He wanted the woman he had stripped, humiliated, and thrown out. To sit in that front row, in whatever she could afford, and understand, completely and finally, that she had lost. That was the plan. That was always the plan. 4 black Rolls-Royces turned onto the cathedral road. Not 1. 4. The guests near the entrance turned first. Then the whispers moved like fire through dry grass. Row by row, neck by neck, until even the priest lifted his eyes. The first door opened. A man stepped out. Broad, unhurried, built like a warning. Then another. Then 2 more. 4 men, white suits, faces that told you immediately, these are not drivers. And then the last door opened. A hand reached in, and she stepped out. Gold. Not shining, not sparkling. Gold. The way a verdict is gold. Heavy, structural, final. A gown that didn't ask for the room's attention. It seized it. Diamonds at her throat. Head high, eyes forward. Beside her, holding her hand like she was something sacred. A man that every single person in that congregation instinctively recognized as someone you do not cross. He didn't rush. He didn't smile. He looked at that cathedral the way you look at something you already own. Marcus saw her from the altar, and for the first time since he'd sent that invitation, he understood he had made a catastrophic mistake. Before I tell you what happened when those doors opened, if you have ever watched someone underestimate the wrong person, you already know this story is going to end only one way. Hit subscribe right now, turn on notifications, because what Manchic handed Marcus at that altar, Marcus will spend the rest of his life trying to forget. And the bride? She didn't even make it to I do. She used to think betrayal announced itself, that there would be a moment, a cold look, a slammed door, a change in the air, that would warn you before the knife went in. She used to believe that the people who loved you carried that love somewhere visible, somewhere you could check, the way you check a wound to see if it is healing. Zarina was 31 years old before she understood that the most skilled betrayers carry their knives behind their warmest smiles. It was a Tuesday when her life ended the first time. She had come back to the office early. Her office, the one she had built from a single sewing machine in a 1-bedroom apartment, the one that now occupied 3 floors of a glass building downtown, the one with her name etched in brushed gold above the entrance, Zarina Designs. She had come back because she had forgotten a fabric sample, a small thing, the kind of small thing that later she would think about constantly, because if she had not forgotten it, she would not have seen them. And if she had not seen them, she might have spent years believing everything was fine. The light was on in the boardroom. The door was open just enough. Marcus stood at the head of the table she had purchased. Chloe sat across from him. Chloe, who had been at her side since they were 19 years old, who had been maid of honor at her wedding, who called her every birthday at midnight without fail. Chloe, who was now sliding a document across that table with the careful, practiced ease of someone who had done this many times. Zarina didn't scream. She didn't even speak. She pushed the door open and stood there, and the 2 of them turned, and neither of them moved the way guilty people move in movies. No scrambling, no panic. Marcus straightened his jacket. Chloe closed the folder. That was the moment Zarina understood the full depth of it. Because innocent people jump. Guilty people who have been caught prepare. Marcus spoke first. His voice was calm. That was what she would remember most. Not what he said, but how calmly he said it. He told her the company had been restructured. He told her the documents she was looking at were legal. He told her, without raising his voice even slightly, that her name was no longer on the ownership papers, because he and Chloe had spent 8 months quietly, methodically, legally rerouting everything, every account, every contract, every asset, through a holding company that she had no access to and no claim over. He told her she had signed the paperwork herself. She had. She remembered it. A stack of documents during a tax season 2 years ago, Marcus standing over her shoulder saying, "Just routine filings, baby. The accountant needs them today." She had signed. She had trusted him the way you trust the person who sleeps beside you, completely, without reading the fine print. Because you do not read the fine print on your own husband. Chloe said nothing. She sat with her hands folded on the table, and she looked at Zarina with an expression that was not guilt and was not satisfaction. It was something worse. It was nothing. The face of someone who had already processed all of this and moved on long before Zarina had any idea it was happening. Security walked Zarina out of her own building that same evening. She stood on the pavement with a box of personal items and watched the gold letters of her name above the entrance, and she thought, I built that. Every single piece of it. The clients, the reputation, the collections, the staff. She had sown through nights, pitched through rejections, rebuilt after losses, and it had taken 2 people she loved without hesitation, 8 months, some forged paperwork, and a calm voice to make it disappear. She found a room in a building 2 neighborhoods away. She found a job at a small tailor shop 3 blocks from there, a quiet place, good work, honest wages. Nothing like what she had, but she was still alive, and her hands still knew how to work, and that was enough to keep moving. It was the work that saved her, and the work was what kept her there. Late. On the night everything changed for the second time. The shop closed at 8. Zarina usually stayed until 10, finishing alterations under the good light by the back window. That night the street outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after rain, and she had her head down over a lapel when the back door opened. She did not scream, because there was no time. The man came through the door the way water comes through a cracked wall, suddenly, and all at once. He was tall enough that the doorframe did not give him much clearance. His suit jacket was black and soaked through on the left side. Soaked dark. The kind of dark that has nothing to do with rain. He hit the wall and stayed there, one hand pressed flat against it, breathing in a way that was very controlled and very deliberate, the breathing of someone who has trained themselves not to show pain and was currently losing that fight. Zarina looked at him. He looked back. His face was angular and cold, jaw set like something carved rather than grown. His dark hair was pushed back, damp. Down the left side of his neck, disappearing beneath his collar, ran ink. The beginning of something extensive and deliberate, black lines and shapes that moved when he breathed, the kind of tattooing that does not happen by accident and does not mean anything casual. His hands, when she could see them, told the same story. The right hand braced against the wall showed ink across the knuckles, across the back, wrapping toward the wrist. Not decorative, territorial. The markings of a man who belonged to something that required you to carry its proof on your body permanently. She did not ask who he was. She did not ask what happened or where he came from or what the dark spreading stain across his ribs meant. She said, "Sit down before you fall down." He looked at her for one more second. The look of a man calculating whether trust is possible. And then he sat. She had a first aid kit behind the counter. She had steady hands. She had spent enough years working with sharp things and delicate materials to know how to be precise under pressure. She worked without speaking, and he sat without speaking. And when it was done, she taped the gauze and stepped back and washed her hands at the sink. He said, "You didn't ask." She said, "It wasn't my business." Something shifted in his expression then. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. The way a man who has spent his entire life surrounded by people who want things from him looks at someone who, for once, simply didn't. He stood slowly, adjusted his jacket, and before he walked out the door, he turned back once and looked at her the way you look at something you intend to remember. She did not know his name until 3 weeks later when 2 men in white suits appeared at the shop door and left an envelope on the counter without a word. Inside was a card. No address. No number. Just a name. Manchic. And beneath it, in clean ink, "If you ever need anything." She put the card in the drawer next to the register and went back to her alterations. She was not the kind of woman who needed saving. She had just spent the worst year of her life proving that to herself. But she kept the card. The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped through the mail slot like something ordinary. Cream envelope, gold lettering, the kind of stationery that announces itself before you open it. Heavy, expensive, deliberate. She recognized Marcus's address in the return corner and set it on the table. She made tea first. She stood at the window for a moment. Then she sat down, opened it, and read. Marcus Adeyemi and Chloe Osei request the honor of your presence at their wedding. The date, the venue, the cathedral address. A place she had driven past 100 times. The kind of cathedral that appears in magazine spreads, that costs more to rent for a single afternoon than most people earn in a year. She read it twice. And then she saw the note tucked inside, separate from the printed card, handwritten on the same expensive cream paper in Chloe's unmistakable looping script. Zarina, come. I want you to see what it looks like when someone actually knows how to hold on to what they have. Come see how real winners live. She set the note down on the table. She sat very still. Outside, a bus went past. Someone's music from the floor above. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary Thursday in a life that was supposed to have been so much more than this. She had not cried in 8 months. She had made a private decision, somewhere in the rubble of being walked out of her own building, that she was done crying over people who had never deserved a single tear. She had kept that decision. She had been disciplined about it. But sitting there at that table, holding that note, looking at Chloe's handwriting, the handwriting of someone she had known for 12 years, someone she had cried with, traveled with, built with. The weight of it broke through whatever she had constructed to hold it back. Not because of Marcus, not even because of the company, because of Chloe. Because of what it meant that the person who knew her best, who knew exactly where she was most vulnerable and most proud, had taken that knowledge and used it like a weapon. Had looked at Zarina's entire life and decided it was something worth dismantling, and had done it. With a smile, and was now sitting somewhere in expensive clothes, writing invitations to watch Zarina bleed. She was still at that table when the knock came at the door. She had not given Manchic her address. She had not contacted him since the night at the tailor shop. But the man at her door was one of the white-suited men she recognized from the envelope delivery, and behind him, leaning against a black car parked on the curb below, was Manchic himself. He looked up at her window. She looked down at him. He came upstairs. He was dressed the way she had come to understand was simply how he dressed. Dark suit, impeccable, top button of the shirt open. The ink at his neck was visible. He moved through her small apartment the way large, dangerous things move through small spaces, carefully, aware of everything. He sat across from her without being invited, glanced at the table once, and saw the invitation and the note lying open. He picked up the note. He read it. The temperature in the room didn't change. His face didn't change. But something behind his eyes did. A shift so controlled it was almost mechanical, the way a very precise and very powerful thing moves from rest into operation. He set the note down. He took out his phone. He dialed a number without looking at the screen. When the call connected, he said 4 words, in a voice that was completely level. "Buy everything the groom owns." He ended the call. He looked at Zarina. She said, "You don't have to do this." He said, "He sent that note to the woman who saved my life. He is going to understand what that cost him." He paused. "And you are going to that wedding. Not to watch. Not to sit in the seat he chose for you. You are going so that he spends every second of that ceremony understanding that he miscalculated, completely, and there is nothing he can do about it." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "Marcus will have guests, important people. If you walk into that cathedral—" "I know," he said. "That is the point." They came to her apartment 2 days before the wedding. Manchic's stylists arrived first. 4 of them, with rolling cases that took up the entire hallway. They did not ask her what she liked or what she was comfortable in. Manchic had already told them, apparently, because everything they pulled from those cases already seemed to understand something about her that she had not spoken out loud. The gown was the last thing they showed her. She had worked in fashion for a decade. She had dressed clients in pieces worth more than most vehicles. She had held extraordinary things in her hands and felt the weight of what expert construction feels like, the difference between something made and something built. When they held up the gold gown, she was quiet for a long moment. It was structural, heavy silk, boned through the bodice, the kind of construction that held its shape with or without the body inside it. The kind of garment that does not drape, it stands. The gold was not metallic, not shimmering, not trying to attract attention the way cheap gold does. It was the deep, saturated tone of something ancient and final. An announcement, not a decoration. She put it on. She stood in front of the mirror, and for the first time in 14 months, the woman looking back at her was not the woman who had stood on the pavement outside her own building with a box in her hands. Manchic appeared in the doorway behind her. He looked at her in the mirror. She watched his expression, the cold precision of it, the control that was so constant it had almost become his resting state. And she watched it do something she had not seen it do before. The guard did not drop. But behind it, something settled. Something that looked, unmistakably, like a man looking at the only thing in a room worth protecting. He walked to where the stylist stood with the jewelry case and opened it himself. The diamonds were not subtle. They were the kind of stones that rewrote whatever room they entered. A necklace, drop earrings, a bracelet. Each piece chosen to sit at the specific angles the gown exposed, as if someone had studied the architecture of the dress and designed the jewelry to complete it. Manchic set the necklace at her throat himself. His hands were careful. The ink across his knuckles moved as he worked the clasp. Those same hands that had taken the foreclosure documents he was about to detonate. And he stepped back and looked at her once more in the mirror. He said, "They built a throne for you to come and cry in. We are going to walk into that cathedral and let them understand that you sat on it." She looked at the woman in the mirror, the gown, the diamonds, the posture that was already changing, already pulling upright, already carrying itself differently, because something had shifted in her chest that she could not fully name but could absolutely feel. She had built something once. They had taken it. But they had taken it from the woman she was before, and that woman was gone now. What was standing in that mirror, in that gold gown, with the most dangerous man in the city standing at her shoulder, was something they had not planned for. Something they had, without realizing it, Made. She looked at Manchic in the mirror. She said, "Then let's go." The convoy arrived at 12 minutes past the hour. 4 black Rolls-Royces turned onto the cathedral road in a single, unhurried line, and the guests who were still outside, the ones finishing cigarettes, the ones who had stepped out to take calls, stopped what they were doing. Not because of the cars exactly, though the cars were enough, but because of the way they moved. Slow, deliberate. The pace of something that has already decided the outcome and sees no reason to rush. The first car stopped at the entrance. The syndicate men stepped out first. 4 of them, white suits against the gray stone of the cathedral, broad and completely still, the kind of stillness that is not relaxed but coiled. They positioned themselves without being directed, 2 on each side of the entrance, and the guests nearby moved back without quite knowing why. The way people move back from the edge of something without being told it is dangerous. Then Manchic stepped out. He straightened to his full height and stood for a moment looking at the cathedral entrance with the expression of a man reviewing a property he had already purchased. The ink at his neck caught the afternoon light. The edge of something vast and dark that disappeared beneath his collar. Black lines that had no casual explanation. His suit was pitch black, tailored so precisely it looked architectural. No tie, top button open. His hands at his sides showed the ink across his knuckles, across the backs of his hands, wrapping toward his wrists. The permanent record of a life that had never been ordinary and had never pretended to be. He reached his hand back to the car door, and Zarina stepped out. The gold hit the light first. The gown caught the afternoon sun the way metal catches it, not a shimmer, a strike. The structured silk held its shape perfectly, the bodice precise, the skirt moving with her in a single, heavy sweep. The diamonds at her throat sat exactly as they had been designed to, not decorating her, marking her. Her hair was pulled up clean, exposing the line of her neck, the set of her jaw. Her eyes were forward. Her posture was the posture of a woman who had already decided that nothing in this building had the power to diminish her, and had made that decision so completely it had become physical. She took Manchic's arm. They walked toward the entrance. The guests outside parted. Inside the cathedral, the string quartet was midway through a processional piece. The music lasted approximately 4 more seconds after the doors opened. Then the nearest guests turned, and the turning spread like a current through the pews, row after row, head after head. And the musicians lost the thread of what they were playing and stopped, one instrument at a time, until the last note dissolved into a silence so complete that the sound of Zarina's heels on the stone floor was the only thing moving in the room. 300 people. Not one of them spoke. The syndicate walked in behind them, steady, unhurried, filling the space without crowding it. And Zarina and Manchic moved down the center aisle together, and she did not look at the faces on either side of her, did not scan the pews for reactions or recognition. She walked the way she had decided to walk, like a woman who had already been through the worst this room could offer, had survived it, and had come back not to ask for anything but to return something. She reached the front row. She sat down. Manchic sat beside her. The syndicate took their positions behind them, and the white of their suits against the dark stone created a wall, clean, immovable, absolute. At the altar, Marcus had stopped breathing in any meaningful way. He had been standing there for 40 minutes already, through the processional, through the arrival of guests, through every moment that had been designed and rehearsed to feel like triumph. He had pictured this. He had specifically pictured this. The moment Zarina walked in, head down, something borrowed and nothing new, and took the seat he had arranged for her, and finally, publicly, understood her position relative to his. He had not pictured this. He stood at the altar and looked at the woman sitting in the front row, and the calculations happening behind his eyes were visible from a distance. The rapid, desperate math of a man trying to identify where his plan had failed, when, and how badly. The gold, the diamonds, the man beside her, the men behind her. Chloe stood at the altar, too, in her wedding gown, ivory, expensive, chosen to be the most striking thing in any room it entered. She had spent 4 months selecting it. She had planned, in significant detail, what Zarina would look like sitting across from it. Poor, she had imagined. Diminished. The kind of woman who reminds a room of what failure looks like, by simply being present. But the woman sitting in that front row was not diminished. She was, by a considerable margin, the most striking person in the building. And Chloe, standing at the altar in her 4-month, meticulously selected ivory gown, understood this the moment she looked at her. The understanding arrived completely and all at once, the way bad news does, with no room to negotiate. Zarina did not look at either of them. She sat with her hands in her lap and her back perfectly straight, and on her face was an expression of such complete, settled calm that it was more devastating than any anger could have been. She looked like a woman watching a play she had already read the ending of. She looked comfortable. She looked rested. She looked, in the language of every person in that room who was paying attention, like the most powerful person present. And she had not said a single word. Manchic sat beside her with one arm resting along the back of the pew, watching the altar with the patient attention of a man who has set something in motion and is now simply waiting for it to arrive. The priest cleared his throat. The string quartet, after a long moment of collective uncertainty, resumed playing. The ceremony lurched back into motion the way a machine restarts after a power cut. Technically functional, but changed. Something had shifted in the room's atmosphere and everyone present could feel it, even the ones who did not understand why. The vows were exchanged. Marcus's voice was not steady. He covered it well enough. Well enough for the guests in the middle rows, maybe. Not well enough for the front row. Zarina heard every hesitation, every fractional delay before each line, the sound of a man reciting words while his attention was entirely elsewhere. Chloe's voice was steadier. Chloe had always been steadier. That was something Zarina had once admired about her. The priest moved through the ceremony. The prayers, the readings, the ritual progression toward the moment that every wedding builds toward. The closing of the contract, the legal and public sealing of the thing. He reached the objection. He asked it the way priests ask it, formally, as a matter of procedure, the words that tradition requires, even though, in practice, nobody ever answers them. If any person here present knows of any lawful impediment to this marriage, let them speak now, or forever hold their peace. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Manchic stood up. He did not move quickly. He straightened to his full height, adjusted the cuff of his jacket on one side, then the other. A small, precise gesture that somehow made the room feel like it was contracting. And then he walked from the front row to the altar with the same unhurried deliberateness he had walked through every door Zarina had ever seen him enter. The priest stared at him. Marcus stared at him. 300 guests stared at him. Manchic reached the altar and stopped in front of Marcus. He looked at him for a moment. Not with anger, not with contempt exactly, but with the specific expression of a man completing a transaction he had planned for a long time and finds neither exciting nor unpleasant. Simply necessary. He reached inside his jacket. He produced a black folder. He held it out to Marcus. Marcus did not take it immediately. His hands had stopped working the way hands are supposed to work. Manchic waited with infinite patience, the folder extended, until Marcus finally took it. Manchic spoke clearly enough for the front rows to hear. He said, "My name is Manchic. You have been telling your guests for 6 months about your foreign investment firm, the one that funded your new portfolio, the one that made you a man worth marrying. He paused. That firm is mine. Every account you opened through it, every asset you moved into it, every contract you signed with my organization. And as of this morning, I have exercised the full terms of our agreement. Marcus opened the folder. His face did not collapse. It evacuated. The color, the expression, the careful architecture of the man he had been performing for the last year. All of it left at once, like a building after a demolition charge, standing for one suspended second before the structure understands what has happened to it. Manchic continued. He said, "Your accounts are frozen. Your cars have been repossessed, all 4 of them, including the one outside. The venue you are standing in will be seized at the end of this hour. The company you built on stolen capital no longer has capital. And the investors your partners have been expecting. They have been notified." He reached into his jacket again. He produced a second document. A single page, folded once. He held it out, but not toward Marcus. He turned and walked back down the aisle to the front row, to Zarina, and he held it out to her. She looked at it. Then she took it. She unfolded it slowly. She read it once. She read it again. It was the deed to Zarina Designs. Her company. Her name. Transferred. Legally and completely. Back to her. She sat very still for a moment. The cathedral was so quiet that the sound of the paper in her hands was audible. At the altar, Chloe had gone through several distinct stages in the space of 90 seconds. The first was confusion. The instinctive, resistant confusion of someone watching something unfold that contradicts everything they believe to be true. The second was calculation. Chloe was, above all things, a calculator. She had calculated Zarina's removal from her own company. She had calculated the 8 months of groundwork, the documents, the timing. She had calculated the wedding, the invitation, the note, the front row seat. She was calculating now, and the calculation this time was arriving at a number that made her go very still. Marcus, who she had selected specifically because he had access, capital, connections. Marcus, who had presented himself as a man building something substantial and lasting. Marcus, she was now understanding in real time, was not only broke, but was in debt. Not ordinary debt. Debt to the organization currently represented by the tattooed man in the black suit, who had just handed his entire financial life to the woman Chloe had written that note to. She looked at Marcus. She looked at the black folder in his hands. She looked at the men in white suits standing behind the front row. The math completed itself. Chloe reached up and pulled the veil from her head. She did it in a single, decisive motion, not dramatically. Not with tears, the way a woman removes something she has simply decided she no longer needs. She set it on the altar beside her bouquet. She picked up the skirt of her gown so it cleared the floor. And then, without a word, without a single word to Marcus, to the priest, to the 300 guests who were watching her with the frozen attention of people witnessing something they will be describing for the rest of their lives. She walked off the altar and down the side aisle toward the exit. She did not look at Zarina as she passed. The side door opened. It closed. She was gone. Marcus stood at the altar alone. The priest had taken 2 steps back. The groomsmen on either side of Marcus had done the same. The instinctive distancing of people who understand that whatever is happening, they do not want to be adjacent to it. The flowers were still perfect. The candles were still lit. The ivory veil was still folded neatly on the altar rail. Everything was exactly as planned except for the groom, who was standing in the ruins of his own wedding holding a foreclosure document, and the 300 guests watching him do it. He came down from the altar. He walked to the front row, to Zarina. He stood in front of her, and what was on his face was not anger and was not pride anymore. It was the naked, unmediated expression of a man who has just understood, completely and too late, the full cost of every decision he had made. He looked at her the way people look at things they have destroyed, when the destruction is finally total and irreversible. He said her name. She looked at him. He started to speak. Something about a mistake, about not understanding, about talking privately. The words that people reach for when they have run out of everything else. He started to go to his knees. Manchic stepped in front of him. Not aggressively, not with any display. He simply moved into the space between them and stood there. And the sheer fact of him, his height, the width of his frame, the absolute absence of any expression that suggested he was open to negotiation, stopped Marcus as completely as a wall. Manchic did not look at Marcus again. He turned to Zarina. He extended his hand. She took it, and she stood, and the gold of the gown settled around her as she rose, that deep, final, ancient gold, and she was standing now, holding Manchic's hand, and she was looking at the cathedral around her, and the 300 silent people in it, and she was holding in her other hand the deed to the company that had her name on it, the company she had built, the company that was hers again. Manchic lifted her hand. He bowed his head over it. A small, precise motion, unhurried, deliberate, and pressed his mouth to her knuckles. When he straightened, he looked at her, and the face that had been cold and calculating and unreadable for every moment. She had known him was none of those things right now. It was simply his face, without the armor, looking at her the way she had seen it look at her once before, in the mirror, 2 days ago, like a man who has spent his entire life navigating a world where nothing is safe and no one is to be trusted, and has found, against all probability, the one exception. He said, "Let's go home." She looked at him. She looked down once at the deed in her hands, her name, her company, her work, returned. And something in her chest that had been braced for 14 months released itself quietly, the way a door that has been held shut finally swings open. She said, "Yes." They walked out of that cathedral together. The syndicate fell into formation behind them. The doors opened. The afternoon light came in. And the 300 guests who had come to watch Zarina's humiliation sat in their perfect seats, surrounded by perfect flowers, and watched her leave, untouched and untouchable, on the arm of the most dangerous man in the city, carrying the deed to her own empire. Behind them, Marcus was still standing in the middle of the aisle, alone in a suit he could no longer afford, in a venue that was being repossessed around him, at a wedding that had already ended. The candles burned on. Now. If you have been watching this from the beginning, if you were there at that front row when the music stopped and the doors opened, then you already know that this story was never really about a wedding. It was about what happens when someone takes everything from a person who built their life with their own hands. It was about the specific, quiet devastation of being betrayed by the two people you trusted without conditions. And it was about what that person becomes, on the other side of it, when they stop waiting for justice and simply build something that justice cannot ignore. Zarina walked into that cathedral because a man who did not know how to love her handed her back the one thing his cruelty accidentally created, a version of herself with no more room for weakness. And Manchic walked in beside her because, in a world that had taught him to trust nothing and protect only what he owned, she had pressed gauze to his wounds in a quiet room without asking a single question. And that had cost him his loyalty permanently. If this story held you, if you felt every chapter land the way it was meant to land, then you are the reason these stories get told. Subscribe right now, not later, because the next story is already coming, and the setup is even more ruthless than this one. A woman who spent 3 years building her husband's company from nothing, only to be replaced the week it went public. And the man who decides to burn everything down is someone her husband has never once considered a threat. Turn on notifications, because when that story drops, you will not want to find it 3 days late. And if this one moved you, if Zarina's walk down that aisle gave you something, drop it in the comments. One word. What did you feel when those cathedral doors opened? Tell me.